My parents laughed when I walked into the room holding a worn folder that was supposed to be worth $2 million. And for a second I wondered if they had rehearsed the timing of that laugh, because it landed the moment I stepped across the threshold. That was the moment I realized they were not afraid of me at all. They thought I was a joke. They thought the whole day would end with me humiliated at their feet. Then the lawyer saw the gold seal on the folder and went pale like he had just seen a loaded weapon pointed at his chest. I had not planned to bring the folder out this early. The plan was to let the room settle first, but the moment I saw their smug faces, something inside me tightened. The day my grandmother died, she had told me I would need to be brave. At the time, I thought she meant emotionally brave. I did not know she meant courtroom-level brave. I did not know she meant today. Earlier that morning, I had parked my car 2 blocks away from the firm. I sat there watching the tinted windows of the tall building reflect the cloudy sky. I remember thinking that the place looked like a vertical mausoleum where people buried the truth under paperwork. I was 33 years old and already tired of fighting my own family. My name is Grant Walker, and this story begins long before the moment my parents laughed at me. But today was the first day I felt something close to freedom. I checked the time. 7:58. I still had 2 minutes before I needed to walk inside. But my palms were sweating and the folder felt heavier than it should have. It was old. The corners worn. The tape across its front was stamped with an insignia I had only seen once in my life. My grandmother had shown it to me the night she gave it to me. "Do not open it," she said. "Do not let them touch it. Give it only to the lawyer. He will know what it means." I did not know what it meant. Not until I saw the way the lawyer reacted later. But that was still an hour away. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Every footstep echoed a little bit because the street was unusually empty for a Thursday morning. My father always said the city woke up slow, like him. My mother said she preferred it that way because crowds made her nervous. I used to believe that. Now I know crowds only made her nervous when they were not applauding her. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was too quiet. A young receptionist nodded at me when I stepped out. Her expression was stiff and polite the way most people get when they sense conflict. She directed me to the conference room, and I thanked her, though my voice cracked in a way that irritated me. Fear does that, even when you think you have grown out of it. I walked down the hallway. My shoes made soft clicks on the polished floor. I kept my hand on the folder in my bag as if it might run away if I let go. When I reached the tall double doors of the conference room, I paused just long enough to inhale. Inside the room was colder than the hallway. The AC vent above the long table was humming. My parents were already there, my father in a navy blazer that he wore to every event where he wanted to appear respectable and wealthy, my mother in a cream blouse that made her look delicate though she was anything but. They looked up at the exact same moment. Their eyes moved from my face to my shoes to the cheap watch on my wrist. They did not greet me. They smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. And then they laughed, not loudly, just under their breath, a silent judgment blown out through their noses, as if the sight of me was mildly amusing. That sound hit me harder than I expected. It felt like childhood all over again. Every time I asked for help with school, every time I said I wanted something different from what they planned, every time I failed to be the son they wanted, that laugh was the sound of dismissal. I sat down across from them. The lawyer, Alan Pierce, cleared his throat. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than anything I owned. He had the file of my grandmother's will in front of him, a thick, blue-bound document. He looked uneasy even before anything happened. My father leaned back in his seat. He said he assumed I was here out of obligation. My mother nodded and said she was glad I showed up because family moments like these were important. I kept my eyes on the table because if I looked at them, I might have said something I could not take back. Alan began reading the opening of the will. My parents looked satisfied. They had spent the last year telling everyone in their country club that the estate was straightforward. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, they said. She had changed her mind too often, they said. They were simply helping her make the right decision. That was their story. Alan was still reading when my father made a subtle hand gesture to my mother. It was the kind of signal people use when they think no one is watching. My mother smiled again. My father folded his arms. They were preparing for victory. I reached slowly into my bag. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. My grandmother had told me to wait for the right moment. But the laugh, that stupid laugh, it pushed me. I placed the red folder on the table with a soft thud. The lawyer stopped reading. His eyes went directly to the seal. For a second, I thought he might faint. His hand trembled just a little. The gold pen he was holding slipped and rolled across the table. My father asked what the folder was. My mother whispered that I was being dramatic again. I did not look at them. I pushed the folder toward the lawyer. He hesitated before touching it. He asked where I got it. His voice had dropped down to something barely audible. "From my grandmother," I said. The lawyer stared at the tape. His face turned pale enough that I saw the veins under his skin. He stood and said he needed to pause the reading. My father looked confused. My mother looked annoyed. I kept my eyes on the lawyer because his reaction was the only one that mattered. He stepped out of the room to make a call. The door closed behind him. My parents turned to me. My father asked what was in the folder. I said nothing. Silence is a kind of power when you have never had any. My mother tried a softer tone. She said she hoped I was not doing something foolish out of spite. She said stress could make people lose perspective. I looked at her hands, perfectly manicured. Hands that had never lifted a box or touched a bill or cleaned anything. Hands that had taken things, not given. The door opened again. The lawyer walked in with a face that looked years older than when he left. He said there was an issue. He said the reading needed to be suspended. He said security would be in the room shortly. That was the moment even my parents stopped smiling. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time in my life, I felt the ground shift beneath them. Not me. And that is where I will pause, because the next few seconds changed everything in ways none of us expected. Security entered the room so fast it felt like they had been waiting on the other side of the door. Two men in dark uniforms stepped in, scanning the table, the folder, my parents, then me. My father straightened in his chair, trying to look like the most important man in the room. My mother folded her hands tightly as if praying for the moment to pass. The lawyer told them to remain seated. He pressed his palm against the red folder like it might explode. My father finally snapped and demanded an explanation. He said this whole thing was unnecessary and that the lawyer was overreacting. His voice carried the confidence he used on waiters and bank tellers, the kind he thought made him sound powerful. It only made him sound frantic. The lawyer did not raise his voice. He simply told him not to touch the folder, not to stand, and not to interrupt. Those words landed like a warning shot. I had never seen my father blink that fast. My mother reached for his arm to calm him, but her hand was shaking. The lawyer sat down slowly. He said he contacted the probate court and that he was required to temporarily halt the reading. He said the seal on the folder represented a restricted classification, used only for confidential filings that bypass normal channels. My father interrupted again, saying he had never heard of anything like that. The lawyer said he would not have needed to hear of it. Only people who dealt with misconduct investigations or internal breaches would know. He kept looking at the folder as he spoke. Something in the air shifted then. The room felt smaller. My mother's smile collapsed into a tight line. My father adjusted his tie twice, though it was not crooked. I sat very still, watching the lawyer because I wanted to understand what he was afraid of. He finally looked at me and asked if my grandmother had said anything else. I told him she had only told me to deliver it directly to him and to never open it. He nodded slowly and looked down. He knew more than he wanted to say in front of my parents. My father demanded the folder again. He said everything should be transparent. He said the estate mattered to all of us. It was the closest thing to honesty he had spoken in years. What he meant was the estate mattered to him. Without it, he was finished. He could not afford the house. He could not afford the image he had built. One of the security officers positioned himself behind my father's chair. The other stood by the door. My father swallowed hard and leaned back. The lawyer took the red folder in both hands and stood. He announced that he would be taking the folder to a secure room to document it before any further steps could be taken. He said no one was to leave the building. My mother gasped and asked if she was being detained. He said no, but the situation required oversight. My father scoffed, but it sounded thin. As the lawyer exited with the folder, my parents and I stayed seated. My mother stared at me with a look that mixed confusion and fear. She whispered my name as if trying to pull me back into the role she preferred. The compliant son who looked away when things got ugly. I did not answer. I was tired of being drafted into their stories. My father leaned toward me then. His voice was low and tight. He asked what I thought I was doing. He said there were rules to these things and that dragging out secret files only made everything worse for everyone involved. It was the closest he came to pleading. The tone did not suit him. I told him the truth. I said I was doing exactly what Grandma told me to do. His eyes twitched at the mention of her. My mother pressed her fingertips to her temple and whispered that this was all unnecessary drama. A few minutes passed before the door opened again. The lawyer returned with another man, older, dressed in a charcoal suit with an expression carved from stone. He introduced him as a court liaison. My father protested immediately, saying it was absurd to escalate things. The liaison looked at him once, then focused entirely on the lawyer. The lawyer explained that the red seal meant there might be evidence of financial misconduct or coercion involving the estate. He said he could not ignore that possibility. My father said it was slander. My mother said it was insulting. I watched their faces shift between outrage and panic. The liaison asked for our IDs. My father protested again until the security guard stepped forward. My father handed it over without another word. My mother followed. I gave mine last. The liaison reviewed everything calmly. Then he said he would be recording statements. My father threw his hand up and said he would not be treated like a criminal. The liaison told him he could leave if he wanted, but the process would continue without him. My father stayed in his chair. The lawyer then asked my parents to clarify the last 6 months of their involvement with my grandmother's finances. My mother stuttered something about assisting with errands. My father said they were managing things responsibly. The liaison wrote everything down. He did not look convinced. I kept silent. I knew anything I said now would only feed their attempts to blame me later. I wanted the facts to speak first. After several minutes of questioning, the liaison said he needed to verify something and stepped out. The lawyer followed him. The door closed. My parents and I were alone with the 2 security guards. My mother leaned forward. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She asked me to explain everything so they could fix it. She said we were family. She said mistakes could be forgiven. I thought about the decades they called me ungrateful whenever I refused to be manipulated. I thought about the nights my grandmother whispered her fears about them, and the way she clutched my wrist the night she gave me the folder. I told my mother the truth. The truth was we were sitting in that room because they had made choices, and now those choices were standing at the door. The door opened, and the lawyer re-entered. His face was more composed, but there was something cold in his eyes. He said there had been updates. He said the probate court had authorized immediate temporary control of the estate to be frozen. My father stood up so fast, his chair scraped across the floor. He loudly objected. He said it was outrageous. The security guard placed a hand near his belt. My father sat back down. The lawyer looked at me then. He asked again if my grandmother had told me when to deliver the folder. I told him she said to give it only to him and only when the reading began. He nodded in a way that made my stomach tighten. The liaison returned with a stack of papers. He placed them on the table. My father reached for them, but the security guard stepped between. The liaison pushed the papers toward the lawyer, who scanned them quickly. He then looked directly at my parents. He said there were irregularities in my grandmother's financial records. He said accounts had been drained. He said withdrawals did not match her handwriting. He said there might be more. My father tried to speak, but his voice broke. My mother stared at her lap, frozen. The lawyer said the next step required formal review in a different setting. He said we were being moved to another office for further questioning. He said the red folder was now officially evidence. The guard opened the door and motioned for us to stand. As I stood up, my father glared at me with eyes burning from behind years of entitlement. My mother looked shattered in a way that would have broken me once. But not today. Today something inside me was different. The hallway outside was quiet and bright. My shoes echoed again, this time louder, clearer, as if the building itself wanted to hear the sound of everything finally shifting into place. And that was the moment I realized the ground beneath all of us was about to break open even more. The fluorescent lights in the hallway felt too bright as we walked, almost like they were trying to expose everything my parents had spent years hiding. My father moved stiffly, each step clipped and angry. My mother trailed behind him, her heels tapping too fast, like she was afraid the carpet might crumble under her if she slowed down. We were led to a smaller room with glass walls and a conference table half the size of the first one. It felt less like a place for discussions and more like a place where decisions were finalized without appeal. The liaison motioned for us to sit. My parents sat together. I sat across from them. The lawyer kept the red folder close to him, one hand always resting on it like he feared someone might try to snatch it. He looked at me in a way that made my chest tighten. It was not sympathy. It was recognition. He understood something about my grandmother that my parents never would. The liaison began asking questions about my grandmother's finances. He asked about withdrawals, signatures, the LLC my father had quietly formed last year. My father pretended not to understand what was being implied and kept insisting everything was legitimate. He said he had been helping his mother in her final months. His voice cracked in a way that made the lie painful to listen to. My mother stepped in, saying they were overwhelmed and juggling too much. She said they never meant for things to look suspicious. The liaison asked her why so many transactions occurred when she had told the hospital she visited only twice a week. She had no answer for that. I stared at my hands, trying to keep my breathing steady. Every piece of evidence placed on the table felt like one more layer of truth peeling open. My father glanced at me over and over, like he wanted to pull me into the lie with him. But I was done carrying his stories. The lawyer stepped out briefly, leaving the folder locked in a drawer. My father used that moment to lean forward. "Grant, listen to me," he said. "You do not understand what this looks like. If you cooperate with us, we can get ahead of this. We can say the folder was a misunderstanding. His tone shifted from scolding to coaxing to threatening, all within 10 seconds. It used to work on me. It did not anymore. I told him the only misunderstanding was that he thought I was on his side. My mother flinched like I had slapped her. She put her hand on her chest and whispered that I was breaking her heart. I remembered her saying the same thing 10 years ago when I refused to co-sign a predatory loan. Back then I believed her. Now I only saw the pattern. The door opened and the lawyer returned with a thick stack of printed reports. He handed them to the liaison and then sat down with visible tension in his shoulders. The court has ordered a preliminary freeze on all active accounts connected to the estate. He said. My father's head jerked up. This is insane, he said. You cannot freeze my accounts. I have obligations. The lawyer answered without looking at him. Your personal accounts are not frozen. Only those tied to your mother's estate. My father muttered something about financial overreach. My mother asked if this would delay the inheritance. The lawyer hesitated for a second before saying the inheritance would not be addressed until all concerns were resolved. Then, the liaison placed a new document in front of us. A transaction log, color-coded, highlighted, organized in a way that left no room for excuses. My father scanned the page, and his face drained of color. He recognized the withdrawals. He recognized his own handwriting on the checks. He recognized the names of stores and contractors who had never set foot near my grandmother's property. My mother whispered that they could explain. The liaison said there would be time for explanations, but not here. A formal hearing would be scheduled. Evidence would be examined. Statements would be sworn. My father sat back in silence, jaw tight, eyes fixed on a corner of the table as if hoping the wood grain might rearrange itself into a way out. The room fell still until the lawyer cleared his throat. I need to ask a final question, he said. Grant, has anyone attempted to contact you regarding your grandmother's legal documents before today? I hesitated. My parents looked at me like they already feared my answer. 2 months ago, my father called me twice in one night. He said my grandmother needed help signing papers. He would not tell me what kind. When I asked to speak with her, he said she was resting. When I said I would visit the next day, he told me not to come. The lawyer pressed his fingers against his closed eyelids. Thank you, he said. My father's voice rose. He said I misunderstood. He said he was only trying to keep my grandmother comfortable. He said stress was bad for her heart. My mother nodded rapidly, trying to build a wall of agreement. The liaison wrote everything down without looking up. A knock sounded at the door. A woman stepped in, the firm's administrative manager, holding a folder of her own. She whispered something to the lawyer, who nodded slowly, then turned to us. There is additional documentation we need to review. Some of it may require law enforcement involvement. For now, we need you to remain available and not leave the building. My father erupted. He said no one had the right to keep him here and that he had done nothing wrong. The security guard stepped closer. My father swallowed his protest and sat down again, staring daggers at me. My mother began quietly crying. She kept repeating that none of this was fair. None of this was meant to happen. She said she had trusted the process. She said my grandmother always favored me, and maybe this was her way of punishing them. I wanted to tell her it was not punishment. It was accountability. But saying that out loud would have only escalated everything. So I kept still and waited. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Time felt warped in that small glass room. The lawyer finally returned with a new sheet of paper and laid it in front of my parents. This is authorization for a forensic audit of all transactions tied to the estate, he said. You are both required to comply. My father's mouth tightened. This is harassment, he said. This is procedure, the lawyer replied. My mother's voice wavered. She asked what would happen next. The lawyer said the evidence would determine the next steps. He said nothing more. We sat in silence until the liaison dismissed us for a short break, instructing the guards to escort us down the hall. As I stood, my father leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You did this," he said. "You think you are righteous, but you have no idea what comes next." His breath was cold. His tone was colder. I walked out of the room before he could finish. The hallway felt sharper now, the lights harsher, the building heavier. And as the guard motioned us forward, I realized the ground was not just breaking open. It was beginning to swallow someone whole. The guard led us down a quieter hallway, one lined with framed photos of the firm's founders. Their stern faces watched us like they had seen every kind of betrayal pass through these walls. My mother kept wiping her cheeks, even though there were no more tears left. My father walked ahead of us with the stiff posture of a man pretending he still had control. I stayed a few steps behind, needing the distance. They guided us into a waiting room that looked more like a doctor's office. Neutral walls, soft lighting, a table with magazines no one had touched in years. The guard told us to stay here until the liaison called for us. Then he stepped outside and closed the door. My mother sank into a chair and stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. My father paced in a tight line, muttering under his breath. He paused only when he felt my eyes on him. "You think this will end well for you," he said. "You think the truth is on your side?" His voice rose with each sentence. "But the truth is what people believe, and people believe the one who speaks first." I let him finish, then said nothing. Silence irritated him more than any argument ever could. It made him feel unseen. My mother finally spoke. "Grant, honey, none of this is necessary. If you know something that can help us, please say it. We can work through any misunderstanding. Just tell us what your grandmother said before she died." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the desperation in her voice had the same shape as the desperation in my father's. She wanted information, not the truth. She wanted the version that helped her. The door opened before I could respond. The liaison stepped in and asked me to follow him. Only me. My father protested immediately. He said questioning us separately was unethical. The liaison ignored him. As I stepped into the hallway, my mother reached toward me like she was grabbing for a life raft. I did not let her touch me. The liaison led me into a small interview room with one table and 2 chairs. He took the seat across from me and set a recorder on the table. He said it was just a preliminary interview. He said I could decline to answer anything I did not want to. He said they needed clarity. He did not say why he looked exhausted already. He asked when my grandmother gave me the red folder. I told him it was 3 days before she passed. She had been lucid, calm, more focused than I had seen her in months. She had called me to a room in the assisted care facility and asked me to lock the door. She pressed the folder into my hands like she was passing me something living. She told me not to open it. She told me my parents would not understand. She told me the lawyer would. The liaison listened without interrupting. He took notes even when the recorder was on. He asked if I had ever discussed the folder with my parents. I told him no. My grandmother had warned me that even hinting at its existence could be dangerous for the outcome of the estate. He nodded slowly. Then he asked if I had any reason to believe my parents would have mishandled my grandmother's finances. I hesitated, not because I doubted the answer, but because saying it out loud felt heavier than thinking it. "Yes," I said. He watched me, not with surprise, with confirmation. I told him about the withdrawals, the sudden interest in my grandmother's accounts, the night my father asked me to sign something for her, the way he shut down when I asked questions, the way my mother intercepted calls from the facility, the way they both insisted everything was fine while avoiding every detail. The liaison asked if I had evidence. I said the folder might have it. He said they suspected that too. He asked if I knew anything about an LLC under my father's name. I shook my head. I had not known until that morning. He looked like he expected that. He asked if I feared retaliation from my parents. I nearly said no out of habit. Then I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he leaned close in the conference room and blamed me for everything. I said, honestly, that I was not afraid of them anymore. But I understood the question. The liaison closed his notebook. He said they were bringing in a forensic team to evaluate the documents in the folder. He said my statement would be added to the preliminary record. Then he said something strange. Your grandmother trusted you for a reason. I did not know how to respond to that. He escorted me back to the waiting room. My father was on his feet before I walked in. What did you tell them? He demanded. What lies did you repeat? I sat down without answering. My mother whispered my name like a plea. The door opened before either could push further. This time the lawyer entered. We need to proceed to the main hearing room, he said. The probate judge has issued an emergency request for review. My father looked like someone had punched him. My mother looked like she wanted to crawl out of her skin. I stood, feeling the weight in my chest settle into something sharper. As we followed the lawyer down the hallway, the tone of the building felt different. More footsteps, more closed doors, more urgent voices behind glass. Something had shifted outside our little world, too. When we entered the hearing room, it was larger than the conference rooms. Rows of chairs, high ceilings, a raised bench where a judge would sit. The air felt thinner, stretched. A single file rested on the judge's desk. The red folder sat next to it. We did not sit yet. The lawyer asked us to remain standing until instructed. My father grumbled, but obeyed. Another man entered. Not the liaison. Someone with a badge clipped to his belt. He spoke quietly with the lawyer, then left the room again. My mother leaned toward me. Please, Grant, whatever is happening, please stop this before it goes too far. I looked at her. Really looked. The woman who had guilt-tripped me my whole life. The woman who weaponized her fragility whenever responsibility got too close. This time she looked fragile for real. But I also saw the calculation in her eyes. She was bargaining. She was afraid not of losing me, but of losing something she believed she was owed. Before I could decide whether to answer her, the door behind the judge's bench opened. The judge walked in. My father straightened. My mother wiped her face. I braced myself. The judge took her seat. She opened the red folder. She read something we could not see. Then she lifted her gaze to us. We are here to address allegations of financial misconduct involving the Walker estate. My father's mouth fell open. My mother whispered no over and over like she could undo the moment. The judge continued, and after reviewing the material submitted, I must inform you that the concerns raised are significant. My heart pounded against my ribs. The judge closed the folder and set it aside. We will begin formal questioning now. All parties will remain present. My father turned to me, eyes burning with something unmistakable. This is your fault, he whispered. But the judge called his name next, and the ground began to split even wider. My father stepped forward as the judge called his name. He tried to answer with confidence, but the sound that came out was thin and frayed. The judge asked him to state his involvement in managing my grandmother's finances during the last year of her life. He cleared his throat and said he had only stepped in to help with routine tasks because she had been confused and needed support. The judge asked if he had documentation to prove that authority. My father froze. His jaw tightened. He said the paperwork must be in one of her files and that everything had been done out of concern for her well-being. The judge glanced at the liaison, who opened a binder and turned it toward her. She studied the page for several seconds. Then she looked back at my father. This signature is not consistent with the decedent's handwriting. My father blinked. My mother gasped softly beside him. I felt something settle in my stomach. Not satisfaction, but a confirmation of something I had suspected for too long. My father tried to speak again, but the judge raised her hand. She asked him if he had ever taken money from any account tied to the estate without written authorization. He said absolutely not. He said everything had been transparent. His voice trembled at the end of the sentence, the way it always did when he lied. The judge signaled to the liaison, who opened another folder and laid out a row of enlarged images. They were scans of checks, transactions, transfers, dates, signatures that looked strangely stiff. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I had seen it on my father's old invoices from his contracting days. He had always printed his letters in a tight, square style. My grandmother wrote in loops and curves, graceful strokes from a lifetime of teaching children how to hold pencils correctly. The difference was unmistakable. The judge asked my father again if he recognized the signatures. He stared at them with a blank face. The kind of blankness people use when pretending they are processing new information. He said the scans must be mistaken. He said someone else must have handled the transactions. The judge leaned back in her chair and watched him. She did not react. She did not argue. She simply let the silence hang in the room until it pressed on all of us. My mother stepped forward then, voice breaking. She said they never meant any harm. She said they were overwhelmed and trying to help. She said my grandmother had always been difficult and that she had insisted on doing things her own way. The judge asked her if that justified removing funds without consent. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. The liaison walked toward the bench and handed the judge a new document. She scanned it, then lifted her eyes to my parents. We have confirmation from Mountain Federal Credit Union that attempts were made to access restricted accounts using an outdated power of attorney. The institution flagged the activity. My father swore under his breath. My mother whispered something like, "It cannot be," but the words barely formed. The judge continued, stating that an additional report indicated someone had impersonated a facility staff member to request personal information about my grandmother during her final week. Her gaze sharpened as she asked both my parents if they had anything to say about that. Neither did. I felt my pulse in my throat. The pieces were falling faster now, sliding together in ways that exposed everything they had built, everything they had tried to bury. The judge shifted her attention to me. She asked when I last spoke to my grandmother. I told her about the night she gave me the red folder, how she had insisted I deliver it directly to the attorney, how she seemed clearer that night than in weeks. The judge studied me, as if trying to see whether I understood the gravity of what I had been carrying. She asked if I had ever opened the folder. I said no. My grandmother had told me not to. She nodded once. The liaison retrieved the red folder from the table and handed it to the judge. She opened it methodically, turning the pages slowly. The room was so quiet I could hear my mother breathing through her fingers. My father was completely still, like someone waiting for a verdict in a case he already knew he had lost. The judge finally closed the folder and folded her hands. This is substantial evidence of intentional financial misconduct. My mother choked on a sound that was too sharp to be called a cry. My father's shoulders dropped. The fight drained out of him in one visible motion. The judge said a forensic audit would move forward immediately. She said both of them would be required to comply with document requests. She said the estate would remain frozen. She said law enforcement might become involved, depending on the results. My father snapped then. He shouted that this was a smear campaign, that they were being targeted unfairly, that I had poisoned the process with false accusations. He stepped toward the bench. Security moved before anyone else could. The guard placed a firm hand on my father's arm and told him to sit. My mother grabbed him, telling him to stop, that he was making it worse. He sank back into his chair, eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The judge turned to me again. "Mr. Walker, there is also a separate matter that must be addressed. It concerns financial activity linked to your name in 2014. I felt the breath catch in my chest. My hands went cold. The judge explained that during the preliminary review, auditors noticed a loan application from 9 years ago tied to my Social Security number. A loan I had never seen. A loan that had defaulted and been written off. A loan that had quietly damaged my credit for years. My mother whispered something to my father that I did not hear. My father's jaw clenched. The judge asked if I had been aware of that account. I said no, not until this moment. She nodded and made a brief note. The court will determine the origin of that application as part of the broader inquiry. I stared at the floor, the room spinning just slightly. All those years I blamed myself for struggling financially, for being denied mortgages, for being questioned by lenders. All those years I thought it was my fault. The judge dismissed us for a recess. She instructed the liaison to escort my parents to a separate room while I remained with the attorney. The guards guided them out. My mother looked back only once. My father did not look at me at all. When the door closed, the lawyer exhaled and rubbed his forehead. He said he had handled difficult cases, but this one was different. He said my grandmother must have known exactly what she was protecting me from. He said the red folder was not just evidence, it was strategy. I felt my chest tighten again. But this time it was not fear. It was something heavier and more complicated. The lawyer rested his hands on the table. "Grant," he said, "there is more in that folder than financial records." She left instructions. I swallowed hard. What kind of instructions? He hesitated. "Instructions for what comes next." I sat back, unsure whether to breathe or brace myself. The lawyer opened the folder again, and that was when everything shifted into a new kind of unknown. The lawyer slid a single sheet of paper from the folder and placed it between us. The edges were worn, like my grandmother had held it many times before deciding it belonged here. His eyes moved across the page slowly, as if confirming it was the same document he had seen earlier in private. He tapped the top corner once and leaned back. "Your grandmother left a directive she wanted executed only if certain conditions were met." He spoke quietly, like the room itself might lean in to listen. I steadied my voice and asked what she meant by conditions. He handed me the page. My eyes drifted across her handwriting. The familiar loops and gentle curves that always made her notes feel like conversations rather than instructions. "If anyone attempts to alter my estate through fraud, coercion, or deception, the enclosed evidence is to be delivered to the court immediately. My grandson Grant is the executor by my decision, not by tradition. Trust him. He knows what integrity looks like." I had to blink a few times. My throat tightened in a way I could not hide. The lawyer waited, giving me room to sit with it. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table as a kid while she corrected my homework with the same steady handwriting. It felt unreal that she had planned all this years before the moment she put the folder in my hands. The lawyer pointed to a second paragraph. "She also states that you are to be notified about the loan in your name. She believed you would uncover it eventually and did not want you to blame yourself for the consequences." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not grief. Something in between. A realization that the damage they had done to me stretched further than I ever understood. The door opened then. The liaison stepped in and handed the lawyer another document. He asked if we were ready to proceed. The lawyer nodded and stood. He motioned for me to follow. We walked through another hallway, quieter than before. The building felt like it was holding its breath. The guard outside the interview rooms gave a small nod as we passed. I wondered if he already knew the outcome, if he had seen enough families shattered by greed to recognize the pattern. We reached a room smaller than the hearing chamber, but larger than the interview space. My parents sat on one side of the table. My father's face had gone gray around the edges. My mother looked wrung out, like every emotion she used to manipulate people had drained out of her. The judge had not returned yet. The liaison asked us to sit. The lawyer placed the red folder on the table again, close to him but not out of reach. My father spoke first. "Grant, you need to understand something. Your grandmother was not well. She was confused for years. Anything she said or wrote near the end was influenced by her condition." He said it with a tone that tried to sound rational, but his hands betrayed him. They twitched every few seconds. My mother nodded, clutching a tissue with both hands. She said my grandmother had never been fair to them, that she had always held grudges, that I was too blinded by affection to see it. The lawyer cut them off before they could build momentum. "The court has verified that the directive predates her decline. It was drafted almost 8 years ago and reaffirmed 3 years later. Your mother was fully competent at the time." My father shut his eyes as if the room had tilted. My mother whispered something like, "It cannot be." But nothing she said made sense anymore. The liaison cleared his throat and placed 2 new files on the table. He said they had reviewed the contents of the red folder and compared them with the estate's financial history. He said discrepancies were no longer just suspicious. They were actionable. My father's voice rose again. He said this entire situation had been blown out of proportion. He said family matters should not involve courts. He said they were being humiliated. The liaison did not react. He said an officer from the sheriff's office would be reviewing the documents next. He said the forensic team from Mountain Federal had already confirmed irregular digital signatures on 3 authorizations tied to the estate. My mother wiped her face, leaving faint mascara smudges on her fingertips. She whispered that they were only trying to prevent chaos in the family, that my grandmother had been difficult to manage toward the end, that they were trying to make things easier for everyone. I stared at her, and for the first time I saw a hint of recognition in her expression. Not guilt, recognition. She realized that none of her words could reshape what had already been written into evidence. Her power was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. The liaison asked me to confirm one detail. He read a date from his notes, a day 9 years ago. He asked where I had been on that date when the fraudulent loan was filed. I remembered it instantly. I told him I was working an overnight shift at a warehouse outside Pueblo, trying to save money to finish school. I told him my father had asked me earlier that week if he could use my credit for a business expansion, and I had said no. He nodded and wrote quietly. My father looked like the air had been knocked out of him. His shoulders sank. His voice faded to something hollow. The judge finally entered the room. Everyone stood. She took her seat and reviewed the notes placed in front of her. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said to the liaison. Then she looked directly at my parents. "Based on the evidence gathered, you will both be required to participate in a full forensic audit. Additionally, the attempt to file a loan under your son's name will be examined as part of a separate inquiry." My mother began to tremble. My father stared at the judge like he was trying to memorize her face for a later argument. The judge continued speaking, outlining procedures and obligations. My mind drifted away for a moment. I kept hearing my grandmother's voice, the soft tone she always used when she wanted me to understand something deeply. Integrity is a long road. Make sure you stay on it even when others step off. The judge concluded with one final instruction. She said both parties would be expected to return after the audit. She said violating any aspect of the order would have consequences. She said the estate remained frozen. When she stood, the room shifted again. Everyone rose. Security stepped forward. The liaison gathered papers. My father finally spoke. "Grant, you do not have to let this happen. We can fix this as a family." I looked at him. For the first time, he seemed small in a way I had never imagined. A man stripped of his confidence, stripped of his control, stripped of his narrative. I told him something I had never said in my life. The truth is already here. Whether you accept it or not is your decision. He stared at me, stunned, as if the sentence had landed somewhere he was not prepared for. The guard motioned for us to step out. My parents were escorted first. I followed a few steps behind. The hallway felt colder now. Not empty, not hostile, just colder. Like the building understood the weight of what it was holding. As we approached the elevator, the lawyer touched my arm slightly and said we were not done yet. I asked what was next. He looked at me with a kind of steady seriousness I had only seen in people who had weathered storms far bigger than this. Your grandmother did not just leave evidence, Grant. She left instructions for your future. And now that the court has acknowledged the directive, we can finally open the rest of the file. The elevator doors slid open in front of us, and I stepped inside, knowing that the next thing I learned might change everything again. The elevator doors closed with a dull slide, and the quiet inside felt heavier than the entire floor we had just left behind. The lawyer stood beside me, holding the red folder with both hands, as if it were something fragile or dangerous. Maybe it was both. The descent was slow, each floor number blinking past like a countdown towards something I could not see yet. When the doors opened in the lobby, the afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows. It should have felt warm. It only made me squint. The lawyer motioned for me to follow him to a small conference room near the back of the building, one I had never noticed before. It looked unused, almost forgotten. But the lights were already on inside, as if someone had prepared it for this exact moment. He closed the door behind us and set the red folder on the table. My pulse jumped. I had seen the outside of it for months. I had never seen inside. I sat down slowly, hands on my knees, trying to keep steady. The lawyer took a seat across from me. He rested his fingers lightly on the folder. You understand that what is inside of this was never meant to be negotiable. Your grandmother prepared it for one specific purpose. I nodded, even though my throat was tight. I was not sure I understood anything yet, but I wanted to hear whatever came next. He opened the folder. Not all the way. Just enough to slide out a sealed envelope that had been tucked beneath the documents we already reviewed. The paper was thick. The seal carried the same gold emblem. My grandmother had written my name on the front in the soft, looping script I had seen on every birthday card she ever gave me. My chest tightened. For a second, I could not breathe. The lawyer pushed the envelope toward me. I picked it up carefully and ran my thumb along the edge. The room was quiet except for a faint hum from the air vent. I broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. Her handwriting stretched across the page. Gentle, steady, unshaken. She had written it long before her health declined. That much was clear. That much was. I read the first line, then the next, and the next. My hands began to tremble. Not from fear, but from a rush of something I had not felt since before she died. A sense of being seen. A sense of being chosen. She wrote that she had watched my parents use me for years. She wrote that she saw the way they drained my confidence as easily as they drained her accounts. She wrote that the loan in my name had broken her heart, and that she had vowed to protect me from ever bearing the weight of their choices again. She wrote that I had a future outside their reach, that I deserved stability, that I deserved peace. And then she wrote something that made the lawyer exhale softly when he saw my reaction. She had changed her will years ago, naming me executor, but she had also created a trust, a sizable one. Not only her home, not only her savings. She had consolidated investments. She had liquidated assets. She had prepared everything for transfer, and the trust was now mine, all $2 million of it. I lowered the page slowly. My jaw felt locked. My mind spun. For so long, I had carried the feeling that I was barely holding my own life together. For so long, I believed my setbacks were my own failures. For so long, I had lived under the shadow of parents who made sure I never stood on solid ground. Now the ground shifted under me for a different reason. The lawyer watched me carefully. She was deliberate. He said, she knew what she was doing. She planned this with remarkable clarity. I swallowed hard. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else when I spoke. What exactly did she want me to do with all this? The lawyer turned a few pages inside the folder and pulled out another document. This one looked newer. A typed letter, but signed by her hand. She wanted you to manage the trust responsibly, not recklessly. She wanted you to live without fear of your parents taking anything from you again. She wanted you to understand your own value. You were never the disposable one. Grant, you were the one she believed in. My eyes burned. I looked down so the lawyer would not misinterpret it as weakness. He sat back slightly. There is more, and we will go through it, but not yet. First, we need to address the situation with your employment. Your parents sent anonymous emails accusing you of misconduct at Mountain Federal. Human Resources opened a file. That file will need to be resolved. The room tilted for a moment. I had forgotten about the emails, the investigation, the way my supervisor had looked at me last week with something resembling suspicion. I asked how he knew. He said the court had been notified once the loan tied to my name surfaced. The fraudulent application from 2014 connected to a pattern of behavior. The accusations against me were part of that pattern. He rested his hands on the table. Your employer will receive a statement from the court. The inquiry against you will be closed. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The weight of it left my body slowly, inch by inch. My parents had spent years building stories that made me question myself. Now, one by one, those narratives were collapsing. I asked him what would happen to them. The lawyer did not sugarcoat anything. They will face the audit. The sheriff's office will investigate the signatures, the loan, the impersonation at the care facility, the misuse of the estate. Depending on the findings, charges are possible. He paused. And probable. I leaned back in the chair. I thought of my father's voice accusing me in the hallway. I thought of my mother's trembling but calculated grief. I thought of the years I spent trying to win something from them that never existed in the first place. The lawyer closed the folder carefully. There is one final matter. Your grandmother requested that you visit the property in Santa Fe before any further decisions about the estate. She wrote that clarity comes when you stand where your roots began. I recommend honoring that before the next hearing. I nodded slowly. I had not been back to her house since the memorial. The memory of it felt preserved in time, like a photograph. Warm light, faded carpets, the smell of mint tea. I stood up. The lawyer gathered the papers and handed me a smaller envelope. This one contained the codes for the trust account. He said I did not need to make decisions now. He said grief and responsibility were not meant to collide in one day. As we walked toward the exit of the firm, I felt an odd steadiness forming inside me. Not comfort, not triumph. Something more grounded. Something I had not felt since childhood. Outside, the city buzzed with late afternoon traffic. Sunlight bounced off car roofs and windows. People walked with purpose, unaware of the shift occurring in my life. The lawyer stopped at the curb and held the door open for me. We meet again tomorrow, he said. Bring the letter and rest. You will need it. I thanked him and stepped into the street, the paper in my pocket like an anchor. I walked a few blocks before stopping at a bench near the plaza. I sat there listening to the distant sound of a fountain. I unfolded my grandmother's letter again, tracing each word with my eyes. She ended it with a line I had not noticed before, one written so softly it nearly blended with the fibers of the page. You are stronger than the story they tried to write for you. I pressed the letter between my palms and closed my eyes. For the first time, I believed her. And somewhere inside me, something began to settle into place, ready for whatever waited in the next room, the next day, the next chapter of this unraveling truth. I opened my eyes slowly and folded the letter again, slipping it back into my pocket as the late afternoon breeze shifted around me. The plaza had grown quieter, the shadows longer. Something in me felt steadier than it had in years. I stood from the bench and began walking back toward my car, each step feeling less like a retreat and more like a direction I had finally chosen for myself. The drive to Santa Fe the next morning felt different than every trip I had ever taken there. No tightness in my chest. No need to rehearse conversations. No fear of what waited inside that house. When I turned onto the long road leading to my grandmother's property, the sun was just warming the horizon. The adobe walls looked exactly the same as they always had, soft and warm, like they were holding every memory of my childhood inside them. I parked, stepped out, and unlocked the front door. The scent inside stopped me for a moment. Lavender and old books, the same as the last day I had visited her. Light filtered in through the blinds, catching dust in the air that danced like it knew the house was awake again. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen still had her favorite blue mug sitting on the counter. The study had stacks of papers, organized in her meticulous way. Her reading glasses rested beside the armchair facing the window. In her bedroom, I found another envelope, this one propped against a small wooden box on the dresser. My name written in the same looping script. My hands were steady this time when I picked it up. Inside was a short note. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the truth had already begun its work. She wrote that the box contained things she thought might help me understand her choices. She wrote that forgiveness was not a requirement, only clarity. I opened the box. Inside were photographs, some old, some newer, pictures of her and me at the lake when I was 5. A photo of her and my father in the early years, his smile real in a way I barely remembered. Letters she had never mailed, notes about the estate, copies of her communications with attorneys from years before. She had been preparing for this long before I ever knew something was wrong. At the bottom of the box was a key, a small silver key with a tag that read, "Storage." I recognized the handwriting. I sat on the edge of her bed and closed my eyes for a moment before calling the number on the tag. An hour later, I stood inside a storage facility on the edge of town. The manager walked me to Unit 114 and left me there. I used the key, and the door lifted with a metallic groan. Inside were boxes, labeled, sorted. Her handwriting again. I opened the first one. Inside were financial records going back 15 years. Receipts, bank statements, letters she had written but never sent. Some addressed to me, some addressed to my father. None had been mailed. I opened one addressed to me. She wrote that she had watched the distance between my parents and me grow like a crack in a foundation. She wrote that she wanted to intervene sooner, but my father had made it clear she was not welcome in decisions about my life. She wrote that this storage unit was her way of protecting the truth until the right time. I opened another box. More documents, more evidence, more proof that she had seen everything. My parents had not fooled her. They had only convinced themselves she was too old to fight back. I sat in the unit for a long time, reading through the pieces of a story I had lived inside without ever seeing fully. When I stepped out, the sun had moved high above the buildings, bright enough to sting my eyes. The next hearing took place 2 weeks later. My parents sat at one table with their attorney. I sat with mine. The judge reviewed the audit findings. My parents had withdrawn over $160,000 through unauthorized transactions. They had fabricated signatures. They had attempted to access accounts illegally. They had filed the fraudulent loan in my name. They had impersonated care staff at the facility. The judge's ruling was firm. They were removed permanently from any role involving the estate. They were barred from accessing the property. Criminal referrals were issued for review by the sheriff's office and the district attorney. My parents sat frozen as the decision was read. My mother's tears were silent. My father's face was blank. Like everything he had built his identity on had dissolved beneath him. The judge turned to me at the end. The estate will transfer to the executor as outlined in the verified directive. Your grandmother planned carefully. You have her clarity now. Use it wisely. When the room dismissed, my parents stood. My mother looked at me with an expression I could not name. My father opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe a curse. In the end, he said nothing. They walked out without looking back. The lawyer packed his documents and handed me a final envelope. This one contained the completed transfer papers for the trust. He said I had handled everything with more restraint than most people could manage. He said my grandmother had been right about me. I drove back to Santa Fe that evening. The desert sky stretched out wide and dark around me. Stars flickered to life. The house was quiet when I entered, but it no longer felt heavy with grief. It felt like something waiting, like the start of something instead of the end. I sat at her kitchen table, the one where she taught me how to balance a checkbook, the one where she whispered truths she hoped I would remember someday. I unfolded her final letter again and let the words settle inside me. You are stronger than the story they tried to write for you. For the first time in my life, the story felt like mine. If you have ever lived through something like this, or if parts of this story feel familiar in ways you cannot quite name, share your thoughts with me. Your voice keeps stories like this alive. And if you want more of these real consequences and real justice tales, stay with the channel and let me know what you want to hear next.